because that's a Fugazi. All right?
That's a Fugazi? How do you know it's a Fugazi? You looked at it for 2 seconds.
Well, it's a fake.
Yeah, I know what a Fugazi is.
It's all a Fugazi. You know what a Fugazi is?
No, Fugazi. It's a fake.
Yeah, Fugazi. It's a wazi, it's a woozy, it's a fairy dust. It doesn't.
Coin Fugazi.
Coin Fugazi.
Coin Fugazi. Coin Fugazi. Coin Fugazi. Coin Fugazi.
Welcome to the Coin Fugazi podcast. I'm your host, C. Edward Kelso, and this is a segment taken from a much more in-depth interview in Coin Fugazi podcast episode 1, which is published in its entirety as a standalone episode. But what you're listening to is a part of that much longer discussion. So if it sounds a little truncated or cut off at one point and you're like, wait, whoa, where did that come from? That's because it, again, is a part of that much longer, much more in-depth interview in episode 1. So if you want more of this discussion, more in-depth, or you want to see where it was, where it came in the context of another part of the conversation, check out Coin Fugazi episode 1 with Jonathan Toomim. Otherwise, enjoy. Coin Fugazi proudly uses read.cash to help distribute our content. Head out to read.cash /@CoinFugazi, all one word, and check out how we're incorporating the platform. Then also check out how people and businesses from all over the world are using crypto as a currency, rather than just speculating, to demonstrate the power of peer-to-peer electronic cash. Tip, comment, blog, join communities, and so much more. That's read.cash. Read.cash. To the OGs for his work as a junior dev on Hearn's Bitcoin XT, and then for co-founding Bitcoin Classic, and really a big block advocate, and someone that, again, people in the space, in the know, have a great deal of respect for. Of late, he's become, I wouldn't say the center of the controversy, but he's certainly in there with regard to Bitcoin Cash and everything that's going on with it.
I'd say maybe the match that started the fire.
He's sort of the John Brown of our current civil war here, and so the Harper's Ferry is the DAA. We'll get into all that, but first, I'm being rude. Thanks, Jonathan, so much for taking time out to speak to me.
My pleasure.
All right, so let's get on with it. I think before we get into the development stuff, I was pretty impressed by your work early on when, if memory serves, in the COVID crisis here in the United States, we were getting information from all the top dogs, at least government officials, that if anything, masks were either not important, or it wasn't a big deal, or give it over to healthcare professionals. And I remember you, because I follow you on Twitter, all of a sudden kind of popping into this idea. You really took to the mask thing early, right? Yeah,
I mean, there's a few ways of framing this. One way of framing it is that I'm just naturally anti-authoritarian. And so, whenever the authorities said that masks didn't work, I just had to tell them that they were wrong. But another way of framing it is that, I'm actually not a developer. I know a lot of people think this, but
okay.
My degree is actually in molecular biology. I'm a neuroscientist by training. And so when I saw the things that the CDC, the WHO were saying about masks, I dug into research, and I saw that that the research did not support the position that they were taking. The research also did not quite support the opposite position that I wanted to take.
Right.
That basically what we had was an instance in which we had an absence of evidence. And they were saying that in the absence of evidence, we should conclude that they don't work. Whereas my position is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There's no evidence of an absence of effect of masks. And if anything, there was circumstantial evidence of a very, very strong effect, protective effect of masks. And the size of that effect was exactly what you would predict from the physics studies. Basically, like for surgical masks, there was a study done in Australia that looked at how likely a parent was to get sick with influenza if they were caring for a child who had influenza, if they were or were not wearing a surgical mask or a P2 mask, which is like the equivalent of an N95 in Australia. And from physics simulations, we can see that for 0.1 or 0.3 micron particles, about 70-ish% of the particles are blocked if you're inhaling through the mask by a regular cheap surgical mask. So that means about 30% get through. And what they found in this study was that giving masks to people did not protect them from the virus. And that was their main outcome measure. But if you looked at whether the people actually wore the masks, only about 30% of them wore the masks. And of those 30% who wore the masks, they were 74% less likely to get the virus. They were 74% protected against influenza. And that latter finding was statistically significant, but basically this is what's called a post hoc analysis.
Right.
And the standards of evidence-based medicine say that post hoc analyses are not trustworthy because they're susceptible to p-hacking. They're susceptible to this thing where you just do a bunch of comparisons afterwards and you only report the comparisons that ended up being statistically significant. And there's a bunch of other studies that are similar, that like either had very low adherence rates or small sample sizes or both. And so like in most of these cases, most of these studies, there just wasn't strong evidence saying that they didn't work. There was like some circumstantial evidence saying that they might work really well, they might not work at all, we don't really know. And ultimately, when the virus came, when COVID came, the scientists who were making these public statements were not the scientists who had actually done the basic research, and they weren't aware of all these quirks in the research, all of these caveats and reasons why the research was inconclusive. So like the CDC was citing several studies that had somewhat strong evidence in favor of a very large effect size, but they cited it in such a way to say that masks didn't work. Like there was a Jefferson from 2008, one of the papers from Hong Kong showed that 68% of people who wore masks during SARS-1 in 2002, 2003 were protected from the virus in a correlational study. But the CDC cited this study as somebody cited this study as showing that surgical masks are no worse, or sorry, N95 masks are no better than surgical masks. Like there was no statistically significant difference between the two. And then they also claimed elsewhere that surgical masks were ineffective. That meant by extension that you would expect for N95 masks to be ineffective,
right,
unless they were fit tested. And they had like this whole glass house of conclusions that were built on these very rigorously or very like precise logical connections that ignored the uncertainty in the underlying findings and ignored the difference between a non-positive finding and a finding of no effect. Like there's, just because you don't see anything doesn't mean that it's there, but you're just like, like Luke Skywalker with the blaster covers over his head while waving his lightsaber around. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there.
Yeah,
so,
and well, the reason that I bring it up in the context of our talking about things Bitcoin Cash today is I think it highlights a few things, and as you already alluded to, sort of your anti-authoritarian streak, but also what an empirical guy you are. So you're just one of these dudes who will just deep dive into a subject, as we're hearing now, just comb through everything, come to a conclusion, and then you act on it. And so you take all this information, even though this is long before government actually starts mandating masks in some cases and fining people for not wearing them. So at this point, they're at the absolute opposite side of that equation. literally encouraging people not to use them or not buy them or hoard them or whatever. And so you take all the information you've done, and what happens next?
Yeah, I mean, just to back up a little bit, the anti-authoritarian thing, that was a joke. I'm not actually anti-authoritarian. I'm a authoritarian. And so like what I do is I look at the evidence and I make decisions for myself based on what I think the evidence says. And then if I find that there's an authority figure who disagrees with the evidence, that starts to like get me a little bit like it's there's somebody wrong on the internet kind of phenomenon, but times 10. Because it's not just somebody wrong, it's the person who's making the decisions for everybody. And I consider that, when there's a massive group decision that's being made that's incorrect, I consider that to be a much bigger problem than when there's a couple of people who are making the incorrect decision. So yeah, so when I find something that I think is an underappreciated truth, that tends to be what I fixate on and what I try to do. And this is just kind of always been what makes me tick and what motivates me. It's always been finding these things that we as a group, as a society, as individuals should be doing better or doing more of.
Yeah, and yeah, I can definitely see that thread just through our conversations and me watching your work from afar. So what do you do with this information, with the mask, just to kind of put a bow on this particular segment? You get this information, but you actually do something with it. You don't just sit there and postulate and pontificate. You actually turn it into a form of activism.
So I try to figure out, given this information, what can I do? Can I do something personally that will make a difference? Can I convince other people to change their behavior in a way that will make a difference? And like, what's going to be the path that I can take in order to make the greatest impact? And with the masks thing, I saw two paths. One was be aware, sarcasm coming, social media warfare. I could go on and publish either statements on Twitter or on Reddit, or I could talk to my friends on Facebook and convince them of the importance of masks, or I could write articles on it. And I started to actually do some research, hoping to turn it into a peer-reviewed article or preprint by going around and collecting YouTube videos of people walking on the streets in different cities at different times and measuring how many of them were wearing masks and what type of masks they were wearing, so that we could do a correlation to see if that explains some of the variance in how quickly the disease spread. So I did this for Japan, and I've got like a graph of the mask use over time in Japan. Did a little bit of this for China, did a bunch of it for New York City, and I've got these actually up on one of our websites on maskprotectors.org/maskwatch, if anybody's curious. But I never got it totally refined, and eventually the New York Times did something very similar and published a much better map of mask usage. So I was really happy to see that get out. But what else could I do? Well, one of the issues in March, April, was that, first, one of the things that happened was that when the virus hit China, China ran out of masks. And so China started asking everybody all around the world, hey, can you send us masks? And this was done on personal levels mostly, but also through the Chinese embassies and through networks of Chinese Americans or Chinese nationals who are living abroad. And one of my friends, I used to live in China for a while, by the way, one of my friends from Shenzhen started doing this. She started getting and organizing shipments of masks from the United States to China. And then finally China got the virus under control, and then it started spreading elsewhere. It started spreading in first Italy and into Iran, and then Spain, and then the United States and the UK. And the United States had most or a lot of its supplies, a lot of its commercial warehouse supplies depleted to be sent to China. So now we had no masks. And that caused huge problems in the the hospitals and in the medical setting because they just didn't have the N95s that they needed, or even the surgical masks. Those were short for a while too. They didn't have the masks they needed in order to keep their workers safe. And this was exacerbated by a culture that emphasized single usage. Like they would use one N95 per patient visit and then throw it away. So a mask might be used for like 15 minutes and then discarded. And that's fine when you only have one patient every week that needs that level of protection, or one patient a day that needs that level of protection, because then you're just using one mask a day. But once you start getting wards filled with COVID patients and you have to visit maybe 50 patients a day, you go through your mask supply pretty darn quick. So, so that was a problem, the overconsumption. There was also the problem of the undersupply. So I tried to tackle both aspects. I did some research and I found that, hey, you can sanitize masks very easily using a toaster oven or using 50 degrees Celsius to 90 degrees Celsius dry heat or moist heat, could be steam, for somewhere between 30 minutes and 60 minutes. And so I started supplying some doctor friends with toaster ovens and with instructions for how to do this. I also started supplying them with KN95 masks that I imported from China and surgical masks. And the goal was to actually try to put half of the masks on medical personnel and half the masks on super spreaders or potential super spreaders like bus drivers or store clerks or anybody who's in contact with either a lot of people or a highly vulnerable population. And we just never were able to get to that part because the desperation from the medical staff was so great. So yeah, we got something like 15,000 masks total.
Wow.
And we're distributing them. The last, what was it? 5,000 plus 4,000, last 9,000 arrived pretty much right when the mask shortage ended. And so like we started getting reports from the people who previously had been desperate for masks saying, actually, we're good now. And so that was around late April, early May, I think, that things started to get caught up. So at that point, like it seemed that the for-profit supply chain had caught up, and so we started tapering off our operations.
Super interesting, and I find it a really nice, again, look into your way of thinking and how you approach the world. I think some of this debate that we're having in the Bitcoin Cash community roughly parallels, I guess, how you think versus, say, the more axiomatic. Well, I'll leave it like that, and so we can get into the next segment here. But if people are wondering why the heck is he belaboring this COVID stuff and masks, and why I'm asking you so much about it, it's again to kind of highlight how you work and what your modes of operation are.